Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're located around the world. And thank you for tuning in for our last of our series of webinars in 2018. This one is entitled The Conduct of Early Phase Studies in Countries Outside of China, or as I refer to, E5 Bridging Chinese Studies. So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Bill Van Nostrand. I am the head of Global Alliances and Client Relations for ClinActis. Also on the phone today is Dr. Christophe Tournier, who is the founder and CEO of ClinActis, which I will do a brief overview of his credentials and background in a few of the upcoming slides. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have about 40 years in this industry, and along the way, I owned one of the first CROs in the world called In Vivo Inc. back in the early 80s through the 90s, and I grew it as a multinational CRO corporation with offices in Asia, Europe, and the United States, and we were the preeminent CRO in the world doing late-stage clinical trials, mostly phase 3B, phase 4. A couple other logistical things. I will go through the slide presentation as your host and presenter today. And at the end of that, we will open it up based on time allotment to questions and answers. Any questions and answers that we do not get to, we will get back to you within a 48-hour period, along with the copy of the presentation that we give today so that you won't have to take a lot of individual notes. So that being said, let's go on to the first slide. I want to just give a brief background on ClinActis, which is a full-service CRO in APAC. It is established more than 10 years ago. We service the pharmaceutical, medical device, medical nutrition, and biotech companies, as well as CROs. We do a lot of rescue work for CROs, and we supplement finding sites and/or providing monitors and regulatory affairs to those large major global CROs as necessary. What is our value proposition? ClinActis is a multicultural company. It's a team that's able to communicate effectively with international country-specific clients. We are exclusively focused in Asia-Pac. That's everything from India all the way to Australia, New Zealand, and on up to Taiwan and Korea. We are very flexible in our approach to working with the clients, and everything from scope, budgeting, and contracting. And as a Far East CRO, we're committed, most importantly, to implementing international ICH GCP standards in clinical trials. I like to refer to ClinActis as a Far East CRO that does clinical trials as a Western CRO. Many of our site investigators and PIs were all trained in the US or Europe, so they have that background and understanding of how to conduct clinical trials according to FDA and EMEA standards. And in fact, most of the studies that we do are for or as a part of global filings and pivotal studies for major pharma and biotech companies to both the FDA and the EMEA. So what is our vision and our mission? Our vision is to become the reference FSP, functional service provider CRO, which is specialized in conducting clinical research in APAC and APAC only. We strive to employ people with a genuine expertise in the region with a passion for excellence and to work with our clients in a most proactive way. All our CRAs, as an example, have special and personal relationships with the CRCs and the PIs at the sites. And they're all local to the site, so they're not centralized. They're all located in each individual country near the academic centers to which we provide our phase 1 to phase 4 global trials. Our mission is based on providing our clients with a unique and dynamic expertise in applying the global drug development standards, the ICH, E5, all the way through E18 standards of conducting clinical trials, in our case, in Asia Pacific. So let me introduce Dr. Christophe Tournier, who was an MD by training. He was trained in France, in Paris. And after his initial training, he went to work for a period of time at the National Medical Research Institute of France, which is equivalent to our NIH here in the United States, specializing in drug development, anti-HIV products. After that, he worked for a major biotech company as the head medical director in charge of development of their HIV products. Along the way, he worked for major pharmaceutical companies such as Sanofi, major CROs such as Parexel and Pharmanet, in those cases opening up their clinical operations in Asia. So he has worked in virtually every country, all 12 countries in Asia, has deep domain knowledge of the health authorities in those countries, the processes, the accounts, the sites, the people, the languages. He is a very talented person and probably the most experienced person in all of Asia-Pac in conducting these critical studies on a global basis. And we'll hear from him at the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining us. So what are we going to talk about today? This is a copy of our agenda. We're going to start with talking about the traditional IND and NDA approach in China. We'll move to the rationale why to conduct early phase studies outside of China. We'll have an introduction to the clinical trial country site selection process, how we select those sites, accredited sites, an understanding of the submission requirements in each of those targeted countries as authorized by the CFDA/NMPA, which is the new name for the CFDA. We'll look at the challenges and considerations to conduct early phase studies at accredited sites outside China. We'll give you some estimation of patient costs for PK, PD, SAD, MAD studies in those targeted countries. And we'll end with a conclusion of which countries and sites might make the most sense for people looking to take advantage, large advantage of this opportunity. So let's start with the traditional IND-NDA approach to China. And for those that are on the call here that are from Asia Pacific, and some people are actually from China as part of this call, they understand very clearly what the process is in China. For those people outside of China that are trying to get a clinical trial application for a protocol, we know that the process to do the early development of PK/PD, SAD, MAD, BE/BA studies is somewhere in the range of 10 to 12 months, plus or minus 2 months. If then you move on to phase 2 and phase 3 in China, that's additional 24 months plus or minus 4 months, which is a total of like 34 to 38 months, which is a very lengthy process. And we know that it's time and money when having these conversations. So what is our recommendation here? Our recommendation is based on many, many years of experience, a part of my background and experience of working for 5 years, 3 to 5 years for a major independent phase 1 facility here in the United States that really was known as the leader in what's called Japanese bridging studies or Asian bridging studies, where we did hundreds of these studies and submitted that data to everyone from Japan to Korea to Taiwan to Philippines to Thailand to Malaysia, on and on and on, and proved that this model was a very effective model, cost-effective model, and time savings model. So we said, well, why not continue this model of trying to get products into China in a more accelerated time frame? So what we're suggesting here, obviously, is to look at something called bridging studies. And that's taking the early development trials, phase 1, PK, PD, SAD, MAD, BEA, and looking at the phase 1 results and then submitting that directly to the CFDA. And upon approval of that documentation and submission, they then would move on to phase 2, phase 3, and then do your NDA submission. So doing it outside of China and submitting it is the average time period is 4 to 6 months, plus or minus 2. and then you go all the way to your NDA submission is 24 months. So that's a half-time savings, basically, a half a year to a little more than half a year savings, which again is time and money, and we'll explain how that process can even be enhanced further in the presentation. So what is the rationale to conduct these early phase studies in countries outside of China? Well, the part of the rationale is, number one, is to accelerate regional drug approvals, to be more efficient and cost-effective drug development, very important of increasing patent life. Patent life for every year to 2 years could be tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies. We want to have cross use of that early data from one country to the next or within a region, such as all of Asia Pac. We want to solve the drug lag issue with global simultaneously drug development. We want to complete the clinical data package required by local authorities. That would mean that doing this just in Taiwan as an example, but then using that data from Taiwan into China as part of the COC. We want to be able to meet ICH E5 guidelines about the impact of ethnic factors on the acceptability of foreign clinical data, as we call FCD. We want to minimize the duplication of clinical data. Why do the same study twice when you can do it once? We want to have bridging requirements to extrapolation of FCD data to the new region. We want to enhance global development and provide adequate characterization of the PK/PD, the critical aspects of efficacy and safety, and dose response. Well, how did this all start, or when did this all start? This really started in May of 2017, which is really only a year and a half ago, where the CFDA put forth new recommendations and guidance of allowing trials to take place outside of China and be submitted inside of China, but at this time for only early development. As of today, the CFDA, which by the way is now called the NMPA, which is the National Medical Products Administration, is increasingly recognizing the global nature of drug development beyond ICH E5 to include and adapt to the ICH international guidance and relevance of everything from E6 to E18, as well as FDA-issued guidance documents conducting studies outside the United States. In other words, you could conduct studies in Asia, and we do many of those as part of ClinActis as global pivotal studies, and use that data as part of a submission to an FDA process, IND or NDA. And the same for the EMEA holds true. And that's how also includes the guidance documents from the MRCT and EMEA, okay? These are exact examples of products that have begun this process of E5 bridging, where initial studies have been done outside of China, submitted inside of China, and has sped up the development process. But they've been done in different formats, everything from a sequential format, which means you do it in outside the country first and deliver it inside, or you do parallel development, meaning you're doing it in Taiwan and you're doing it in China at the same time. You may do something that's all Asia simultaneously in all countries in APAC. Or you may just do a single global development in Asia, Europe, and the United States. And these are examples of that. So the new E5 bridging model in China can also be used at the phase 2 level. So we talked previously about just doing early development for phase 1, but it can also be used for phase 2. And if we use that bridging data outside of China, it then, once accepted, can go right to phase 3. Now we're talking about even more enhanced and significant time savings and dollar savings. So the NMPA acceptance criteria of foreign data is broken into 3 categories. Category 1, 2, and 3. 1 is fully accepted, 2 is partially accepted, and 3 is not accepted at all. So what is it what we're looking at in category 1? It's when data is authentic, it's complying with GCP, and the clinical trial inspection requirement. Overseas clinical data can support efficacy and safety assessment, which is critical in your PK/PD SAD/MAD for targeted medication, without the ethnic sensitivity factor impacting efficacy and safety. So what does partially accepted mean? Partially accepted is data is still authentic, complying with GCP and clinical trial inspection requirement as above. The overseas clinical data can support efficacy and safety assessment for targeted medication, and this is with ethnic sensitivity factor impacting efficacy and safety. But what will not be accepted in category 3? Well, obviously, if there are critical problems in authenticity, integrity, and traceability of overseas clinical data, non-supportable, doesn't pass through audits and things of that nature, which has happened multiple times in the past in Asia, depending on the country. Overseas clinical data cannot fully support efficacy and safety assessment for the targeted medication and or with ethnic sensitivity factor impacting efficacy and safety. Now, we thought this is a really important chart, and this kind of summarizes some of the previous slides, where now we're comparing the IND-NDA timeline with the traditional approach versus the new E5 bridging model in China. So the left side of this chart is the timeline of traditional IND and NDA approach, where we're looking at a total IND application timeline of somewhere between 35 and 42 months, as highlighted in yellow down below. And to the total NDA application time is 55 to 66 months. But if you follow the bridging concept of phase 1 and possibly phase 2 too, now your total IND application time period is only 15 to 21 months, and your total NDA application time is 27 to 39 months, which is exactly half the time frame of following that process within China. So this obviously has a significant impact in timing, approval, and cost for the pharmaceutical and biotech companies. So what are the major benefits to conduct early studies in countries outside of China? 1, global development strategy for all regions, faster clinical trial approval time in a COC concept, which I previously mentioned, faster startup times in clinical trials, because some countries outside of China takes a much less period of time, which we will show in upcoming slides, to get the clinical trial application approved and your IRC approved than it does intra-China. Much faster speed up of the trial recruitment process, because a lot of these academic sites outside of China have very good databases of patient populations and know immediately, looking at inclusion and exclusion criteria, protocols, where to go, and they have a standard population to a naive population to draw from to run their PK, PD, SAD/MAD studies. You want to meet the unmet medical needs in certain geographic regions or locations, less complex submission dossier requirements in COCs. I mean, it's much easier to do applications in Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore, Korea than it is in China. But here's the big thing. It says an average of 1.6 years in the IND and 2.3 years in the new drug application or NDA time period, as compared to the typical NDA application in China. So let's look at the introduction of the clinical trial countries/sites selection to conduct the early phase studies. So what are we looking at? So we're looking at things such as cost, speed of approvals, and shortcoming of local requirement and limitations in different countries are actually weighted factors that may impact clinical trial country site selection. There are 4 main factors that are going to influence this. They are: select the accredited sites outside of China. Where are we selecting them? Understand the submission requirements in those targeted countries that have been pre-authorized by the NMPA. What are the challenges and considerations to conduct those early phase studies in a country outside of China? And then we want to look at the estimation of cost. So each country in Asia has different costs for conducting clinical trials, and we'll discuss that. So let's talk about the selection of accredited sites. According to the requirements of the NMPA, the primary centers outside of the regions affiliated with the agency that are directly involved in the clinical trial application must be accredited in advance by the NMPA if we plan to submit clinical trial and the results obtained. There are only 2 hospitals in Hong Kong and 4 hospitals in Taiwan that have already been accredited by the NMPA. The accredited sites in Hong Kong are Queen Mary Hospital, and the accredited site, the second accredited site is Prince of Wales. In Taiwan, there's 4 sites: the National Taiwan University, Taipei Veterans, Lingao, and Tri-Service. But we have to understand the submission requirements in these targeted countries that have been authorized. So let's compare Hong Kong and Taiwan. And we understand, first of all, the good thing is that this approval process is in parallel. What I mean by that is both the ethics committee approval with the PI and the regulatory authority approval for the clinical trial application happens in parallel, meaning the same time. So that as one is approved, the other one is approved. So there's no sequential following as in the United States. You have to get a protocol approved before you can even start the IRB process, which adds time to that. So let's look at the key requirements under the ethics committee for submission. We have to have the submission letter for initial review, the clinical study categorization form, the clinical research ethics review application form, the supplementary information sheet for phase 1 study, if that's applicable. We need the CV of the principal investigators and any co-investigators. We need the principal investigator and co-investigator, any conflict of interest declaration form. We need indemnity agreement for clinical study. We need the certificate of insurance for clinical study, the actual clinical study protocol itself, the full investigator brochure, the informed consent form that we're going to use, and that has to be both in English and translated into Chinese or the national country. It needs to be subject recruitment materials, the same process of both English and traditional English or in that country. And the documents and materials for use by subjects in a study, again, need to be in English and the traditional Chinese or that country. And if we switch over now to the regulatory required documents, you need the clinical trial checklist and application form, the clinical study protocol and the IB, the investigator's brochure, the letter of intent, the CV, as I say before, for the investigator and co-investigators, the authorization letter from the PI to authorize ClinActis or whoever the CRO is to handle the clinical trial certificate application. And we do that same process in the United States. Informed consent in the appropriate languages, recruitment materials in appropriate languages, written information intended to provide to subjects in the appropriate languages, certificates of insurance for the clinical study, sample of investigational medicinal product, the IMP, the GMP, the COA, the COC, and the EC approval letter. The key thing here now is we're looking at 16 to 20 weeks in Hong Kong. Now, if we switch to Taiwan, I've highlighted in yellow here really the things that are different from what was required in Hong Kong. So some of the different things, as you see in the ethics committee, was some ECs may request RA approval before the EC submission. You need a power of attorney or letter of authorization. They want DSMB charter if requested, and ADR forms or examples of the ADR forms are going to be used. And on the regulatory side, the physical, chemical, and biological properties, including the placebo, the non-clinical pharmacology ADME and toxicity, clinical experiences that they've had in the past or are conducted in other parts of the world, questionnaires and diary cards, the IMPD, and the CV and the GCP for the PI, sub-PI, and the SC. The important thing here is that we're looking at is this takes an average of 12 weeks versus 16 weeks. So you pick up 4 weeks doing it in Taiwan versus doing it in Hong Kong. So what are the challenges and considerations to conduct early phase studies in accredited sites outside of China? Well, there's several. The objective of the early phase study is to extrapolate the foreign clinical trial data to Chinese population to show there is no difference in ethnicity in Asia and Caucasian data by making comparison between Caucasian and Asian data. In order to increase the success rate, to supplement the bridging data for sponsor submission to the MPA and MPA in the future, there are some specific considerations. We need to look at the next presentation slides. After obtaining the NMPA approval, which means we need approval in advance in order to conduct this study, and there's alternatives to that, which we'll discuss. You will need to indicate the NMPA approval number in the initial submission dossier to the local IRB and the regulatory authority. But there's challenges to be considered. Number one, prior approval of NMPA may take 30 to 60 days or more, depending on the health authorities. It's critical of the selection of an approved PK laboratory, and we must meet the minimum number of subjects. So what does it mean prior approval from the NMPA? All clinical trials need to obtain an NPA approval before we can submit the initial application of any early phase study to a local authority in the accredited sites outside of China. The NMPA will review all CTs, which is the clinical trial application, based on the study material, both clinical and non-clinical, protocol synopsis, the quality, the CMC, before authority provides either. The approval to the CTA and protocol, the request for additional laboratory data, the gap on PK/PD or preclinical data, and the request of additional safety information categorized by have to know or good to know. The NMPA will provide an approval number, physical number for CTA document, and the date of approval of the CTA submission form. The timeline to do this is somewhere between 4 to 12 weeks. But there's ways to overcome these issues. Number one is face-to-face meeting with the NMPA or by phone if you have a good relationship with them. And second is to establish efficient communication with NMPA at the planning stage with the multi-regional clinical trial application. Selection of a PK lab. It's recommended to select the PK lab that comply with GLP requirement as per Chinese guideline and specifically NMPA guidelines. NMPA is willing to accept PK data from the lab that can produce the results of PK/PD analysis according to Chinese guidelines. That's internal Chinese guidelines. This PK/PD analysis should include the format on how the expert PK from the lab should provide the input to preclinical and clinical development plans, evaluation of safety data, animal tissue distribution data, study design, sample size calculation, optimized sampling schedule, non-compartmental and compartmental analysis, PK/PD modeling, and simulation, including population approach. What do we do to meet the minimum subject number? Well, actually, there is no specific requirement from COC regulatory bodies pertaining to the minimum subject requirement in early phase studies if we choose to conduct a study at accredited sites outside of China. What we do know is that these studies that have been accepted by the FDA and EMEA, each cohort in the import chemical drug or for the import chemical drug runs to 8 to 12 patients per cohort. And you might have to run multiple cohorts in a MAD study as compared to a SAD study or a PK study. If you were using a biologic product in a phase 1, we might need as many as 20 in a testing group or cohort group. And if it's a phase 2, we may need up to 100. But whatever it is, we'll need to meet the minimum cases as per CTA requirements in China. So let's look at some estimation of patient costs for the SAD-MAD studies in targeted countries. So if we look at both Taiwan and Hong Kong as an example, which includes the PI fees, administrative fees, lab fees, and PK handling, this is your average cost of Taiwan versus Hong Kong. In both of these, though, examples are oncology tests, which may actually, in reality, be a little bit more than just running the PK/PD SAD-MAD studies. But this gives you a comparison of what our costs have been per patient on the average. And these final numbers that you look here, as an example, in Taiwan, 8,000 to 11,000, you have to add to that plus 50% overhead cost. And these are in US dollars. And you can see in Hong Kong, it's 11 to 15,000. So, it could be as much as, 40, 50% more expensive doing it in Hong Kong than in Taiwan. The estimated fees for the for the MAD study in Taiwan, those are actually a little bit more because of different visit sizes or drawings. And in this case, we have 2 CT scan imaging for, again, both oncology examples, anywhere from 10 to 14 in Taiwan and 14 to 19 in Hong Kong. Again, about 30 to 40% more expensive in Hong Kong. What's the definition of what we mean by these fees? So PI fees are described as the fees to pay to PI to perform the screening, the enrollment, the follow-up patient status as per the procedures in the protocol. The administration fees include the administrative charges, the startup fees of the pharmacy costs, the lab and imaging fees include all the lab testing, including bio, hemo, immunology, urine, x-ray will be used in the study. And the PK handling and other related fees include the blood taking, physical blood taking itself at each PK time period, 24-hour time period, as well as the costs associated with the PK blood drawing, including hospitalization, bed fees, etc. So what are our conclusions? Our conclusions are that the sites have to have equipped or must be equipped with trial facilities, bed, imaging lab, and storage at a minimum. Experienced team members ready to conduct or select the best lab vendor for PK lab sampling. I think that's kind of like already taken care of because China with the CFDA has already pre-approved the PK labs as part of those 6 institutions that they use on a regular basis in their phase 1 units. That keep a list of patient database that are ready to perform the screening, so we have to be able to find those people quickly. Have no conflict on the protocol treatment and procedures when compared to local medical treatments and requirements, and have a majority of patient pools meeting the inclusion-exclusion criteria of the protocol. Precise feasibility activity and questionnaires are required for recruitment in the future. So what about alternative study submissions to the local IRB? As the pre-approval timeline from the NMPA is unknown and or may be lengthy. And we say lengthy, we're talking about 6 to 8 weeks to 10 weeks, somewhere in there, which is not like a year waiting inside China. We will recommend not to apply pre-approval registration number NMPA before we proceed to do initial submission to selected COC site. With that in mind, what our strategy can be is that we can just submit the early phase study in selected COC such as Taiwan as per the standard requirement IRB and HA submission to the country. So you would be submitting these documents as if you were never going to do the study in China or for China, that it was going to be just done for the country of Taiwan. And then upon receiving the number from the CFDA, we could then apply that to the registration forms. And finally, the data from the early phase study from the COC will be submitted as part of a supplementary dossier during the initial submission to the NMPA in China to conduct phase 2 and phase 3 in China. So what's our conclusion? Our conclusion, obviously, is to use Taiwan first, and those factors are based on cost and time, and to consider Hong Kong second. Now, a lot of that Well, you may need, in some cases, to do both countries simultaneously, depending on the number of studies that they have to do and where those populations exist at that time, and that there is no conflict of other trials going on. Why Taiwan before Hong Kong? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, they have 4 institutions compared to 2 for Hong Kong. They have a bigger population, and they have a shorter duration of the IRB and the CA review. And there's also a cheaper per cost per patient in Taiwan than Hong Kong. Ethically, there's no difference between the Chinese, Taiwanese are considered the same, whether it's in Hong Kong or it's in China. Whether it's in Taiwan. So the bottom line we're talking about here is why ClinActis? Well, number one, we have a strong history of doing this. I and other subject matter experts, in fact, there's a person on the phone with us, Ed Kim, who is a subject matter expert in the United States, probably the subject matter expert in the United States, has been doing these studies for more than 10, 12 years in the US, both Japanese and Asian bridging across all Asian countries. So he's as good as anybody at understanding this process. That's number one. Number two, we have MSAs in place and have worked with these 6 sites for more than 10 years. They know us, they're comfortable with us, we know their process. Our CRAs know their processes, they know the CRCs, they know the PIs, they know the health authority people, they know the labs, they know the import, export of medications in and out of the country, which makes them very talented to be able to pull these types of studies off in a fast period of time. And that's a part of just having the most experienced team in Asia. Our CEO, Dr. Christophe Tournier, has been here for 20 plus years. There's very few Western physicians and clinical research people that have been in Asia for that long period of time. Our management team, which is comprised of Dr. Tournier, the head of clinical operations, et cetera, has been there for more than 45 years. As I mentioned before, our CRAs average 7+ years. Our clinical operations person came from Bristol Myers Squibb, running all their clinical operations in all of Asia. We have a deep domain knowledge of the sites. We have patient database or access to those patient databases. We have contracts with them, MSAs in place with them, direct relationships with the CRCs and principal investigators of more than 10 years, as I mentioned previously. We have a trusted relationship with the health authorities that we can talk to them one-on-one as needed, and we have their confidence and trust. We have over 82 ICH GCP compliant oncology sites, over 90 CNS ICH GCP compliant CNS sites with neurologists and psychiatrists board certified. Many of our sites have US and European trained PIs. We have an accelerated study startup of 90 to 120 days to the library of site relationships, contracts, and processes, as well as country logistics. Our phase 1 trials in virtually every APAC country as part of global submissions at substantially less cost and time. And we have a proven research model, such as this E5 concept model that has been proven in the United States, and it's been proven here to accelerate the new drug applications in China. So we thank you today for your time, and we'd like to open this now up to questions and answers for myself, Dr. Tournier, and Ed Kim as necessary. Thank you very much for listening.